Keeping a thriving 5-gallon aquarium can be incredibly rewarding, but it's not as simple as it may seem. The small water volume of the tank makes it more challenging to maintain safe and stable water parameters because even small changes can quickly throw things out of balance. So I wanted to share some tips and tricks to increase the chances of beginners being able to create a thriving 5-gallon tank. Choosing the right equipment for a 5-gallon tank is essential, but the good news is that my default equipment is pretty cheap and very easy to find. I often see people making mistakes with their aquarium accessories because they choose things that are either too large or too powerful for such a small tank, and often they are overpriced for what they actually need. For filtration, I do believe these Nicrew Slim hang-on back filters are the best option on the market right now. I've bought several of these for my own tanks now because they're small and perfect for a 5-gallon setup, and their water flow is gentle enough not to stress your fish. That said, I'm not a fan of the cartridge system with this type of filter that they come with, so I do customize mine with some 30 ppi foam and filter floss for better performance. A sponge filter with a cheap air pump is a good alternative, but I personally prefer hang-on backs, especially for smaller tanks like this because they take up so little space compared to a sponge filter. Next up is heating, and I'm a big fan of these Hygger nano heaters for smaller tanks. These are small, powerful and easily maintain a stable water temperature without taking up much space in your tank. Lighting is just as important, especially for a planted tank, but there's so many options out there it can get overwhelming. Personally, I'm a huge fan of these cheap Seaoura lights for beginners, and I honestly think most people can get very far with one of these. Again, these are cheap just like the other equipment, and they're easy to find on Amazon, and in my opinion they'll work well as a general display light for your tank, but they also have enough power for most low to medium category plants. Plus they come with built-in timers to let you customize your photo period and 10 adjustable light intensity settings so you can adjust it if needed due to algae. So moving on, we get to stocking a 5-gallon tank, as this is another area where a lot of people seem to make mistakes because they accidentally add too many fish. On top of that, a lot of Google's default suggestions are misleading or downright unsuitable for a tank this size, in my opinion, resulting in unhappy fish and a high bio load that will start to cause problems. Now, the gold standard stocking option for a 5-gallon tank is a betta fish, and personally I do highly recommend them. Other options include 2 or 3 guppies, some endlers live bearers or medaka rice fish. But if you're not planning on intentionally breeding your fish, stick with males because all 3 of those species are prolific breeders and can quickly overpopulate a 5-gallon tank. Neocaridina shrimp are another fantastic option for tanks this size. Most of my smaller tanks around the 5-gallon size were initially set up to be shrimp tanks because they work so well in this volume. Shrimp can also coexist with some betta fish, most guppies, pretty much all endlers and medaka, so you can use them as a tank mate for your other fish too. Like I mentioned earlier though, personally I do think a betta fish is the best option for this volume for most people. Water parameter fluctuations are one of the biggest challenges in a 5-gallon tank because the small water volume means that even a small change can have a large impact quickly. Overfeeding, for example, can lead to toxic ammonia spikes, and minor fluctuations in room temperature can cause temporary changes in the tank's water temperature. That's why I specifically recommended the filter and heater I did earlier in the video, because I've tested them extensively in multiple tanks and they work very well. As I mentioned earlier, I personally do customize my filters with some cheap 30 ppi foam and filter floss just to get that extra surface area in there for beneficial bacteria and archaea colonies to help minimize the risk of ammonia spikes. But even with the right equipment, monitoring your water parameters is key. I know that a lot of people don't check their water parameters. Personally, I always check mine at least once per month, but a lot of my tanks it's closer to once per week. In my experience, the liquid test kits are far more consistent with their readings than the cheaper test strips, but Remember that those test strips are still better than having nothing if you are on a budget. If you do notice problems with your ammonia or nitrite levels, then a partial water change will usually help. However, in a tank this small, water changes can create water parameter fluctuations of their own because removing too much water at once can disrupt the tank's balance. To avoid this, stick to a partial water change of between 20 and 30% of the total water volume. In practice, this can actually be as little as 1 US gallon or just under 4 litres of water once you account for the volume the substrate, your decorations and tank accessories take up. So when doing your water changes, always temperature match the new water you're about to add to your tank by adjusting your hot and cold tap as required to avoid temperature shocking your fish and bacteria colonies. And don't forget to add a tap water conditioner to neutralise any chlorine and chloramines because these chemicals can harm the beneficial bacteria and archaea colonies that help maintain water parameters. Adding live plants to your 5-gallon tank is a great way to reduce the risk of ammonia and nitrite spikes because plants naturally absorb these toxins and use them for growth. But I understand that not everybody has the time or interest to care for live plants, so fake silk plants can still be used to add hiding spots for your fish and improve their living conditions and reduce stress levels. That said, live plants offer several unique benefits beyond just their aesthetics and hiding places. In addition to absorbing toxic ammonia and nitrite, plants also use up ammonium, nitrate and various heavy metals, helping to keep your fish safe in such a small volume of water. In my experience, live plants definitely help maintain safe and stable water parameters, and they are definitely worth considering, especially for beginners. To make it as easy as possible, I have dedicated videos on the best plants for beginners and the best floating plants that I link in this video's description. So moving on, and we get to debris and detritus accumulation, as this is another very common issue in aquariums that is made up of decaying plant matter, leftover food and fish waste. Many people resort to gravel vacuuming their tank, which increases the amount of maintenance time required to keep your tank clean. But I never gravel vacuum my tanks, and it can actually cause problems in certain dirted tank setups. Yet if you look at my tanks, it's very rare that you'll see any fish waste or leftover food, and there's two main reasons for this. The first is that I keep shrimp in every one of my tanks, snails in most of them, and I've recently added scuds, sea shrimp and water louse to one as well. These tiny little critters help consume leftover food quickly, so there's no issues with ammonia spikes or water clouding. Although they don't actually eat fish waste directly, they do break it down into smaller pieces, making it easier for bacteria to decompose quickly. Most people think of beneficial bacteria like Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter that help support the nitrogen cycle in our aquariums, but there's also waste controlling bacteria that help break down organic compounds in your tank, drastically reducing the need to actually do any gravel vacuuming. Now you might notice some decaying plant matter in my tanks, but I choose to leave it in there to naturally decompose as a nutrient source for the plants and add some natural CO2. Although this does take longer than breaking down fish waste and leftover food, the same processes will eventually kick in and handle it, preventing large build-ups over time. Moving on, and we get to overfeeding, and this is one of the most common issues in the fish keeping hobby because most of us, myself included, tend to feed our fish far more than they need. And in a 5-gallon tank, overfeeding can lead to water problems surprisingly fast because of the small water volume you have to work with. Thankfully, this is an easy problem to manage. The general advice is to remove uneaten food after around 2 minutes because leftover food can quickly decay and release ammonia. Now this general advice does work well with most species people will keep in a 5-gallon tank, but there are some exceptions like shrimp and snails. For example, my shrimp usually take a while to realise there's food in the tank, and then it can take them hours for the entire colony to finish eating. For beginners, the best approach is to watch your fish eat for a couple of minutes each day over a week. If there is any leftover food after a couple of minutes, you are likely overfeeding, so reduce the amount of food you give next time. And finally we get to algae, and this can be very frustrating for some people, but this is a natural part of an aquarium, especially a new setup, and depending on your approach it can take months to go away. Adding algae eaters like our mono shrimp, neurite snails or algae eating fish can help get rid of the algae, but it only treats the symptom, not the cause. In my experience, algae is usually caused by two main factors, which are an excess of nutrients in the water and issues with your light. So addressing these root causes is essential to manage algae effectively. For excess nutrients, regular partial water changes can help remove the algae's food source and cause the algae to fade. And adding fast-grown stem and floating plants can further outcompete the algae for their food by the plants absorbing the nutrients. For lighting issues, reducing your light's photo period to between 6 and 8 hours per day and potentially reducing the intensity of the light output can significantly help. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful and you'll be able to use some of these tips and tricks in your own 5-gallon tanks. Thanks for watching and have a good day.